The morning of October 12, 1993, began like any other for Carol Williams. The 29-year-old nurse carried her coffee cup in one hand and her shoulder bag in the other as she locked the door of her small apartment in Queens, New York. She was dressed in pale blue scrubs and a light jacket, prepared for her shift at St. Mary's Hospital. It was routine, familiar, and ordinary, but within an hour, that routine would be broken forever. Carol walked to her car, a beige Honda Civic parked outside her apartment building. Neighbors later recalled hearing the click of the car door and the faint hum of the engine starting. At exactly 7:35 a.m., she left for her daily commute, the same road she had taken countless times before. Nothing about her movements suggested trouble. What happened after that short drive has haunted the community for 3 decades. By 8:10 a.m., Carol had not arrived at the hospital. Colleagues grew concerned when she missed her morning rounds, something she had never done before. Calls to her pager went unanswered. By mid-morning, worry turned into alarm. Around 9 a.m., a delivery worker noticed something unusual along a quiet stretch of Queens Boulevard. A beige Honda Civic was idling near the curb. The engine was running, the driver's door slightly open. A cup of coffee sat untouched in the holder, steam still clinging to the lid. On the passenger seat lay Carol's shoulder bag, unzipped with her wallet and identification inside. The worker knocked on the window and looked inside. There was no driver. The street was eerily quiet. When police arrived minutes later, they treated the car as a potential crime scene. Officers noted that the vehicle showed no signs of forced entry or struggle. The keys were still in the ignition. It was as if Carol had stepped out for only a moment and never returned. Detectives began retracing her steps. A neighbor remembered seeing her leave at her usual time. A passerby recalled a tall man standing near the entrance of her building earlier that morning. But nothing connected directly to Carol's disappearance. Her absence spread quickly through the hospital. Nurses whispered in hallways. Doctors called her family. By the afternoon, her brother Marcus was at the precinct, pleading for answers. She would not leave like this, he told investigators. Something happened to her. The atmosphere in Queens that day turned heavy. The discovery of an abandoned car, still warm from the engine, carried a chilling weight. Residents feared what it suggested. Carol had not simply walked away. Detectives canvassed the area, questioning shopkeepers, commuters, and bus drivers. Some reported a woman resembling Carol near a payphone around 7:50 a.m., but the lead quickly faded. Others swore they heard a brief argument near the boulevard that morning, though no one could describe the voices. The physical evidence remained disturbingly thin. The car was carefully dusted for prints, but the results would take time. Officers searched nearby alleys and vacant lots, but no trace of Carol appeared. By nightfall, the car had become a grim landmark. Police tape fluttered under the streetlights, and reporters crowded behind barricades, demanding updates. Residents passing by lowered their voices, speaking of the nurse who had vanished without a sound. The day that began with routine ended in silence, broken only by unanswered questions. Who had been waiting near her building that morning? Why was her car left in such an obvious spot? And where was Carol Williams? Detectives knew one truth. Whatever happened to Carol, it unfolded in a narrow window of time, those short minutes between her departure from home and the discovery of her abandoned car. The search for answers was only beginning, but as investigators pressed forward, they would learn that this disappearance was not a random event. It was the start of a dark story that would stretch across 3 decades. And at the center of it all was a man who had lived in plain sight, hiding a truth that no one wanted to imagine. Before her disappearance became a haunting mystery, Carol Williams was known simply as a nurse who never turned away from anyone in need. At 29 years old, she had already built a reputation at St. Mary's Hospital in Queens for her calm presence and tireless dedication. Patients often described her as the nurse who smiled even when the night was long and the work was heavy. Her colleagues admired her patience. Younger nurses sought her guidance, while senior doctors trusted her judgment. Carol had a way of balancing professionalism with kindness. To her, every patient was more than a chart or a bed number. She believed in listening, in holding a hand when fear was stronger than medicine. At home, Carol's world was simple and filled with love. She shared a close bond with her younger brother Marcus, who was only 2 years apart from her. They had grown up together in a modest apartment in Queens with their mother, Evelyn, after their father passed away during their teenage years. The siblings became inseparable. Marcus later recalled how Carol would push him to finish school assignments and remind him to chase his goals. She wanted the best for everyone, not just herself, he said years later. Away from her shifts, Carol enjoyed the quiet company of books. Her small apartment shelves carried a neat collection of crime and mystery novels. She often joked with her friends that she could have been a detective if she had not chosen nursing, nights when she was not on duty. She would curl up on a couch with a paperback and a cup of tea, lost in fictional investigations that always found their endings. Her life also carried ambition. Carol dreamed of becoming a head nurse, a goal she often spoke about with determination. She had enrolled in leadership courses and was building the skills she believed would help her guide a new generation of nurses. To those who knew her, she was not only hardworking but also forward-looking, planning a future that seemed full of promise. Routine anchored her days. Each morning she prepared coffee, packed her bag with her medical notes, and left at the same time. She was reliable to the minute, a habit shaped both by her profession and her personality. It was this reliability that made her sudden disappearance stand out so sharply. Carol was not someone who failed to call, who missed shifts, or who vanished without explanation. Her co-workers at St. Mary's remember her laugh during lunch breaks, her way of lightening heavy days, and her endless supply of pens tucked in her pockets. Patients remember her voice, soft but steady, assuring them through pain. Family remember her as the daughter who always called her mother before leaving work, the sister who never missed Marcus's milestones. When she disappeared, these details became more than memories. They became reminders of how deeply she was rooted in the lives around her. Every corner of her world reflected her presence. From the hospital corridors where her footsteps once echoed, to the family dinners where her chair now stood empty. Carol Williams was not a headline or a case number. She was a woman with dreams, routines, and bonds that shaped the lives of many. And it was this very ordinariness, this steady, caring life, that made her sudden absence feel so shocking, so unnatural, and so impossible to accept. The community would soon learn that the woman who gave so much light could be taken in a moment. And the question of who had stolen that light would shadow every step of the investigation that followed. Carol Williams left her apartment at 7:35 a.m. that October morning. She carried her coffee, locked the door behind her, and walked down the narrow hallway of her Queens building. Neighbors later recalled hearing her footsteps echo on the stairs, the familiar sound of a routine she never broke. Outside, the city was already alive. Buses hissed at the curbs. Traffic lights blinked in rhythm, and commuters hurried toward trains. Carol slipped behind the wheel of her beige Honda Civic and began her short drive toward Queens Boulevard, the same path she took every morning to reach St. Mary's Hospital. But she never made it. By 8:10 a.m., her absence at the hospital was noticed. A colleague tried paging her, assuming traffic had delayed her. When the call went unanswered, another nurse grew uneasy. Carol was known for her punctuality. By 8:30, unease had turned into concern. At 9 a.m., a delivery worker spotted something strange near a quiet side street off Queens Boulevard. A beige car was idling near the curb, engine running, driver's side door slightly ajar. Steam curled from a coffee cup in the holder. On the passenger seat, a shoulder bag lay open, its contents undisturbed. There was no driver in sight. The worker hesitated, then approached, peering inside. The car keys were still in the ignition. Wallet, ID, and keys all remained untouched. The sight was unsettling, as if the driver had stepped away for only a moment but had never come back. Police arrived quickly after the call. They studied the vehicle with careful eyes. No broken glass. No signs of forced entry. No scuffed marks or torn fabric to suggest a struggle. But the scene told a silent story that every detective recognized. Something was very wrong. Detectives began canvassing the area. They questioned shop owners who had opened their stores early. A bakery worker remembered seeing a woman matching Carol's description at a crosswalk not far from the car's location. Another witness recalled something more chilling, A man loitering near Carol's building earlier that morning. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a jacket pulled tight against the cold. He had been leaning against a wall, staring in the direction of her apartment. When pressed, the witness could not recall his face clearly, just his presence, just the unease he created. News of the abandoned car reached Carol's family by mid-morning. Her brother Marcus rushed the precinct, his voice sharp with fear. She would not leave her things behind, he insisted. She would not leave her car like that. His words echoed the growing suspicion of investigators. Detectives returned to the vehicle, this time treating it as a crime scene. Forensic technicians dusted for fingerprints. Officers searched the surrounding streets, scanning alleyways and parking lots. But every sweep ended the same way. Empty. Back at the hospital, Carol's colleagues gathered in silence. The nurse, who was never late, never absent, had vanished without explanation. By the afternoon, the whisper spread through Queens. A young nurse had disappeared on her way to work, and her car was found abandoned. The mood in the neighborhood shifted. Mothers warned their daughters not to walk alone. Shopkeepers kept their eyes on the street longer than usual. The sight of the beige Honda Civic with police tape wrapped around it became a grim reminder of something hidden, something threatening. That evening, reporters surrounded the scene, their cameras flashing as investigators worked under the harsh glow of streetlights. One officer muttered that the car felt staged, deliberately left where it be found, as if mocking the search for answers. Detectives knew this was no simple disappearance. The untouched belongings, the running engine, the suspicious figure near her building. It all pointed to foul play. But without a witness who saw the exact moment Carol vanished, and with so little physical evidence, the investigation faced a terrifying reality. Carol Williams had disappeared in the middle of a busy city morning, in plain sight of countless people, and yet no one could say where she went or who had taken her. And with every hour that passed, the fear in Queens grew stronger. From the moment Carol's abandoned car was discovered, detectives moved quickly. They knew the first 48 hours would be critical. Officers spread out across the block, knocking on doors, asking questions, and searching for any sign of what had happened during those lost minutes of her commute. Neighbors described Carol as polite and predictable. Most remembered seeing her leave at the usual time, carrying her bag and coffee. But when detectives pressed for details, the accounts blurred. Some claimed they saw her car pull away. Others were unsure if it was that morning or the day before. No one could say with certainty who had been near her vehicle when it was left running by the curb. Investigators turned to the hospital. Co-workers confirmed Carol's routine. She was always early, always prepared. Several nurses remembered she had mentioned feeling uneasy about someone lingering near her building weeks earlier, but she never gave a name. Doctors expressed disbelief. Carol was not the type to vanish. Detectives then reviewed security footage. In 1993, surveillance cameras were sparse, and what existed offered poor quality. A traffic camera on Queens Boulevard showed a blurry image of a car resembling Carol's moving at 7:40 a.m., but the recording did not reveal the driver. No further footage captured where she stopped or what happened next. Attention soon shifted to Carol's personal life. Investigators contacted former boyfriends. One lived in Brooklyn and was cooperative, providing an alibi supported by his workplace. Another, from Long Island, admitted they had argued months earlier but denied any involvement. He, too, was cleared after verification. Each lead promised hope, only to collapse under scrutiny. Amid the flurry of interviews, one name quietly surfaced: Harold Brennan. He was Carol's landlord, a 45-year-old man who lived in the same building. Detectives noted his access to tenants and his presence in the neighborhood that morning. They brought him in for routine questioning. Harold appeared calm. He claimed he had been at home, repairing a leaky pipe around the time Carol left for work. He described her as a nice girl, always polite, and expressed surprise at her disappearance. Without physical evidence or a witness linking him directly, detectives had little reason to press harder. After a short interview, Harold was dismissed, his name recorded only as a passing mention in the early files. Investigators widened their search. Anonymous tips poured in. A caller insisted Carol had been seen boarding a bus headed out of Queens. Another claimed she had been spotted with a man in a leather jacket outside a convenience store. Each report consumed valuable time. Officers followed up, only to find that witnesses had misidentified someone else or confused dates. As hours stretched into days, frustration grew inside the precinct. The timeline of Carol's last movements was fragile, full of gaps no one could close. Detectives knew she had left her apartment, started her car, and begun her drive. After that, the trail vanished. Family members called repeatedly, begging for updates. Marcus visited the station daily, his voice tense with worry. "You cannot let this fade," he told officers. "She needs to be found." His pleas echoed the urgency investigators already felt, yet progress was slipping through their hands. By the end of the first week, the case showed troubling signs. No clear suspect, no reliable witness, no physical evidence beyond the abandoned car. The unanswered questions piled higher than the answers. And though the detectives did not know it then, the man who held the truth, Harold Brennan, had already been in their sight. He had walked out of the station unshaken, blending back into the neighborhood he had long controlled. The early investigation, meant to bring clarity, had instead left detectives chasing shadows. And those shadows would only grow darker as weeks turned into months. Queens was shaken to its core. The news of Carol Williams vanishing without a trace spread from block to block, gripping the neighborhood with fear that people had not felt in years. Her mother, Evelyn, stood on the front porch the morning after the discovery of the car, her hands trembling as reporters swarmed the family's home. She could barely speak, her voice breaking as she begged for her daughter's safe return. Her younger son, Marcus, only 22 at the time, tried to shield her from the flashing cameras. But there was no escape. Their private nightmare had suddenly become a public tragedy. Carol's co-workers at St. Mary's Hospital were equally devastated. They lit candles outside the emergency room entrance, lining the steps with flowers and handwritten notes. Some of her fellow nurses wept openly, their grief mixing with disbelief. How could a woman who dedicated her life to saving others be lost so suddenly? They began calling the case the nurse vanishing, a name that soon made its way into headlines across New York. The community responded with an outpouring of support. Flyers bearing Carol's photo were taped to storefront windows, bus stops, and telephone poles. Volunteers knocked on doors, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual that October morning. Vigils were organized in local churches, with neighbors filling pews and holding hands as prayers echoed to the halls. But with compassion came whispers. At grocery stores and laundromats, people traded theories in hushed voices. Some insisted it had to be someone close to her. Others feared a stranger was prowling the neighborhood, waiting for another chance to strike. The uncertainty was terrifying. Women in Queens began changing their routines, taking different routes of work, walking in pairs, locking their doors earlier at night. The media only heightened the tension. News anchors broadcast images of Carol's smiling face across evening television, alongside footage of the abandoned car. Headlines screamed of mystery, danger, and fear. Nurse missing in Queens became a story repeated night after night, and every newscast seemed to remind the city that Carol had simply disappeared into thin air. Inside the Williams household, the weight was unbearable. Evelyn hardly ate, refusing to rest in case the phone rang. Marcus, who shared a close bond with his sister, struggled to maintain composure. He admitted to friends that he kept replaying their last conversation in his mind, wondering if he had missed some hidden meaning or warning. The guilt was overwhelming, and the silence inside their home felt heavier with every passing hour. The community's fear soon turned into collective determination. Marches were organized, with residents holding signs demanding answers. Strangers stood beside the Williams family, united in grief and anger. Yet behind the unity, there was also a dark realization. If Carol could vanish so suddenly, then no one was safe. By the end of that week, Queens was no longer the same neighborhood it had been before October 12, 1993. Families locked their doors tighter. Parents warned their children more sternly. And Evelyn Williams, surrounded by candles, prayers, and cameras, whispered the words that captured everyone's heart. "Please bring my daughter home." The plea echoed across the city, leaving investigators under pressure and a community waiting in fear. unaware that the darkest chapters of this story were yet to come. Detectives working the disappearance of Carol Williams quickly realized that every new lead seemed to dissolve in their hands. The first weeks of the investigation became a maze of rumors, anonymous tips, and desperate searches that led nowhere. One of the earliest calls pointed police toward a local taxi driver. A woman claimed she saw Carol entering his cab near Queens Boulevard on the morning she vanished. Detectives tracked him down, questioned him for hours, and even searched his vehicle. The driver insisted he had never met Carol. Records of his fares that morning confirmed his story. The witness later admitted she might have confused Carol with another woman in a similar coat. What had seemed like a breakthrough dissolved into nothing. Days later, attention shifted to the hospital where Carol worked. Several nurses reported that a man had been seen loitering near the emergency room entrance in the weeks before she disappeared. He was described as middle-aged with thinning hair, often standing silently by the parking lot at night. Some began to wonder if Carol had caught his eye. Detectives canvassed the area, looking for the supposed stalker. They stopped men who fit the description, questioned security guards, and checked visitor logs. No trace of the mysterious figure could be confirmed. It was as if he had never existed. The phone at the precinct rang constantly with anonymous tips. Some callers claimed to have spotted Carol in Manhattan, walking with a man. Others swore she had been seen boarding a bus to Atlantic City. One caller even insisted that Carol had staged her disappearance, choosing to escape the stress of her life. Investigators followed up on each claim, driving long hours, checking bus stations, casinos, and hotels. Each trail ended the same way, with no sign of Carol. Every false lead drained both manpower and hope. Detectives grew weary as reports stacked up, each more unreliable than the last. Some began to quietly fear that the truth was slipping further away with every passing day. Through all of this, Harold Brennan, the 45-year-old landlord, remained on the periphery of suspicion. Neighbors described him as strange, distant, and overly watchful of tenants. Some remembered unsettling conversations, odd comments about privacy, and the way he lingered too long in hallways. Detectives had briefly questioned him in the first days, but with no direct evidence connecting to Carol, he was dismissed as eccentric rather than dangerous. The oversight would prove haunting. Meanwhile, frustration spread through the community. Families who had once filled church pews at vigils began to question why there were still no answers. Reporters demanded progress, pressing detectives during every press briefing. The phrase false leads became a constant headline, and the sense of failure grew heavier with each article. Inside the Williams home, Evelyn and Marcus clung to hope, but the endless stream of rumors only deepened their pain. Evelyn described the torment of hearing strangers claim that her daughter had simply run away. Marcus grew angry whenever reporters repeated such theories, insisting that Carol would never abandon her family or her patients. By the end of the second month, investigators faced exhaustion. Files filled cabinets. Tip lines went unanswered, and the once bustling search began to slow. Every dead end left detectives staring at the same haunting truth. Carol had vanished, and despite all the noise, they were no closer to finding her. The case was not just stalling. It was sinking, and hidden among the discarded leads was one name that would return again, darker than before, Harold Brennan. Time is the cruelest enemy in any investigation, and in the case of Carol Williams, it became the loudest reminder of absence. Days stretched into weeks. Weeks became months, and then years. Each calendar page that fell carried with it another layer of dust, another layer of silence. The initial urgency that had once gripped Queens faded slowly. The vigils grew smaller. The newspaper headlines shrank, and the nightly news turned its attention elsewhere. But inside the Williams home, the absence never lessened. Evelyn Williams kept Carol's room exactly as it had been the morning she vanished. The bedspread remained neatly folded, her favorite crime novel stacked by the bedside table, and a framed photograph of Carol and Marcus smiling at a summer picnic stood on the dresser. Evelyn often sat in that room at night, staring at the door as if her daughter might suddenly walk in. Every October 12th, the family marked the anniversary of Carol's disappearance. Friends, neighbors, and old co-workers would gather, holding candles and reciting prayers. At first, crowds were large, spilling onto sidewalks. But with each passing year, fewer people came. Some had moved away. Others had simply grown weary of waiting for answers that never arrived. The gatherings became quieter, more intimate, but no less painful. Marcus, who grew from a young man into adulthood carrying the weight of his sister's absence, described the anniversaries as reopening a wound that never heals. The police files on Carol's case grew thicker, filling boxes that were eventually moved into storage at the precinct archives. Detectives who had once promised a family that they would never give up eventually retired. Their replacements inherited the case, but found little new to work with. Technology was advancing, but much of the evidence from 1993 was too limited, too fragile, or too poorly preserved to yield fresh results. What had once been an urgent investigation became a cold case, filed away among hundreds of others that haunted the city. Meanwhile, life around Queens carried on. Buildings changed, businesses opened and closed, and new families moved into apartments that once held the memories of those who had searched for Carol. But one constant remained: Harold Brennan. He never left. Year after year, he continued living in the same building where Carol had last been seen alive. Neighbors described him as quiet, reserved, and solitary. He rarely attended community events, but his presence was impossible to ignore. People whispered about him, remembering the early suspicions, yet without evidence. He was free to move through life unnoticed by the law. To some, his continued presence felt sinister, like a shadow that refused to fade. For the Williams family, the waiting was a slow form of torture. Evelyn grew older with the same question pressing against her heart. What happened to Carol? She attended every vigil, answered every late-night phone call, and welcomed every detective who promised to take a fresh look at the file. Marcus, now an adult with a family of his own, carried the same weight. He admitted in interviews that every time his phone rang unexpectedly, he braced himself for news, hoping for answers, fearing the worst. 3 decades passed in the state of haunting silence. The case lingered like a ghost, neither solved nor forgotten, a wound that never closed. Carol's name would appear occasionally in articles about unsolved cases, usually as part of a list. But to those who loved her, she was not a name in an archive. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. Her absence defined their lives. And through all of it, one truth became more unbearable with every year. Someone out there knew what happened. Someone was carrying the secret of Carol Williams. That secret had survived 30 years of silence. But silence has limits. And in time, shadows have a way of coming to light. The years of silence were finally broken in the spring of 2023. At the Queens Cold Case Unit, Detective Amy Rodriguez sat at her desk, scrolling through a list of dormant files she had been assigned. The Williams case was just another folder among hundreds, a thick stack of reports and photographs that told a story of loss without resolution. Yet something about Carol's name struck her. Perhaps it was the way her photo, smiling, vibrant, filled with life, contrasted so sharply with the bleakness of file. One morning, as Amy sifted through digital notifications from national forensic databases, a message flashed across her screen. It was brief, clinical, and almost easy to overlook. Touch DNA match confirmed. The sample, recovered from Carol's handbag in 1993, had finally yielded a profile. After years of being too weak to test, advances in technology had made it possible. The name that appeared beside the match chilled her: Harold Brennan. Amy leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. The name was not unfamiliar. She remembered skimming through early witness statements where Harold, Carol's landlord, had been questioned and dismissed. His file had been thin, just a note about a short interview, no charges, and no follow-up. Now, 3 decades later, his name had returned like a ghost. She immediately reopened the case. Dust-covered files were pulled from archives, scanned, and laid out across her desk. Carol's last morning, the abandoned car, the unanswered questions, all of it unfolded in front of her. And in the middle of it, Harold Brennan's quiet presence loomed larger than ever. Digging deeper, Amy uncovered a disturbing pattern. Buried in housing authority complaints and old tenant records were fragments of Harold's past. Women who had lived in his building had filed harassment complaints. Some reported him watching them through cracked doors or following them in hallways. Others described unwanted advances, strange late-night knocks on their doors, and threats when they tried to move out. None of the cases had gone far. Most women, fearing retaliation, moved away quietly. The reports ended up forgotten in archives, just like Carol's file. Amy's pulse quickened as she read through each account. It was as if Harold had operated in plain sight for decades, hiding behind the dull respectability of being a landlord. His tenants often came and went, their stories scattered across years. But when pieced together, a chilling pattern emerged. He preyed on women, and no one had ever stopped him. She called Marcus Williams, Carol's brother, to share the news. His silence on the other end of the line was heavy, broken only by a sharp breath. "I knew it," he finally whispered. "All these years, I knew someone had taken her." Evelyn, Carol's mother, sat in the background, her hands trembling as she clutched the phone. For them, it was the first flicker of hope in 30 years, mingled with pain that justice had taken so long. Amy pressed forward. She requested updated surveillance on Harold, now 75 years old, still living in the same Queens apartment building. He kept himself his hair gray, his pace slower, but his habits unchanged. To neighbors, he was just another aging man who fed pigeons on the stoop. To Amy, he was a predator who had evaded justice for too long. The database match gave her a foothold, but she needed more. She reviewed Carol's handbag, now preserved in evidence storage, and arranged for newer testing methods. Fibers, fingerprints, even microscopic traces of skin cells were analyzed again. Each result pointed back to Harold Brennan. The connection between him and Carol, once fragile, was now undeniable. What began as a flicker of hope was quickly turning into a fire. Amy was determined not to let this case slip back into silence. As she pieced together evidence and tenant testimonies, one thought kept her awake at night. If Harold Brennan had harmed Carol, could there be others? The silence of 3 decades was about to end. But when it came the possibility of uncovering horrors far greater than anyone had imagined, Detective Amy Rodriguez knew cold cases could consume investigators. She had seen colleagues fall into old files and never merge, their careers swallowed by shadows of the past. Yet from the moment Harold Brennan's name appeared on her screen, she felt a pull she could not resist. Carol Williams was no longer just a case file. She was a promise Amy could not break. Sleep came in fragments. Her desk filled with photographs, handwritten notes, and boxes of evidence that had not been touched in years. She mapped Harold's life across 3 decades. Every address, every tenant complaint, every recorded police call. What emerged was not the quiet, aging landlord the neighborhood knew, but a predator who thrived in silence. Amy traced property records and found that Harold maintained a small storage unit in Brooklyn, rented since the mid-1990s. On paper, it seemed ordinary, a place for furniture and old records. But the consistency of the payments, never missed for nearly 30 years, raised her suspicions. She obtained a warrant. When officers cut the lock and rolled up the metal door, dust poured out like smoke. Inside were cardboard boxes stacked neatly, each labeled with years. 1987, 1991, 1993, and onward. Amy's chest tightened as she opened the first box. Inside were women's belongings, scarves, hairbrushes, journals, and even photographs with faces cut from frames. None were labeled with names, but each item whispered a story of someone who had once lived under Harold's roof. And then she found it, a small gold locket, its hinge worn from use. Inside was a faded picture of Carol Williams and her younger brother Marcus, smiling together at a summer fair. The discovery froze the room. After 30 years, Carol's belongings had surfaced, hidden in the storage unit of the man who had once claimed to know nothing about her disappearance. The find was damning, but Amy needed more. She began tracking down former tenants, women who had lived in Harold's building across the years. Some were reluctant to speak, their voices trembling as if the fear had never fully left. Others broke down as they recalled encounters that had haunted them. One woman described Harold entering her apartment under the pretense of fixing a leak, only to corner her in the kitchen. Another spoke of him following her late at night, whispering threats when she resisted his advances. None had reported him formally, terrified of eviction or retaliation. Each story carried the same undertone. Harold used a position as landlord to manipulate, control, and isolate women. Carol had been no exception. Amy pieced together a chilling pattern. Harold targeted women who lived alone, who trusted the safety of the building he controlled. Late nights turned into early mornings as Amy connected each testimony with the evidence from the storage unit. She saw the outlines of a predator who had hidden behind locked doors and routine, his crimes scattered across decades. But unlike before, the fragments were no longer separate. They formed a clear and horrifying picture. Amy returned to Carol's file, the photographs of her abandoned car and handbag. With each piece of evidence now tied to Harold, the story grew sharper. He had not been a bystander in 1993. He had been at the center of it all. For Amy, obsession became determination. The case was no longer cold. The silence was cracking. And somewhere inside that silence lay the final truth about Carol Williams. The walls Harold had built around his secrets were beginning to crumble. But Amy knew the most dangerous part was still to come, confronting him face to face. The interview room was stark and cold, its white walls bare except for a small camera fixed in the corner. Harold Brennan sat across from Detective Amy Rodriguez, his frail hands folded neatly on the table. At 75, he looked like any other aging man. Gray hair, lined face, slow movements. But Amy knew the truth buried beneath that quiet exterior. At first, Harold appeared indifferent. He answered questions with short replies, his tone calm, his expression unreadable. When asked about Carol Williams, he shrugged and repeated what he had told detectives 30 years earlier. "I hardly knew her," he said. "She was a tenant, kept to herself. I had nothing to do with her disappearance." His voice carried the same rehearsed certainty he had used decades before. Amy slid a small evidence bag across the table. Inside was the gold locket recovered from his storage unit. For the first time, Harold's mask shifted. His lips tightened, his eyes flickered toward the evidence, and his hand twitched against the table. Still, he denied everything. "That is not mine. I did not know how that got there." Then came the DNA report. Amy placed a folder in front of him, reading aloud the words that tied his skin cells to Carol's handbag. The silence in the room grew heavy. Harold leaned back in his chair, the calmness slipping from his posture. His breathing quickened, his gaze lowering to the table. Minutes passed before the first crack appeared. His voice, when it came, was low and uneven. She was supposed to respect me. They all were. Amy waited, letting the silence press against him. The confession unraveled piece by piece. Harold admitted that on the morning of October 12, 1993, he had knocked on Carol's door under the pretense of fixing a plumbing issue. When she let him in, he used the opportunity to corner her. "I told her she could not ignore me anymore," he muttered, his words trembling between anger and guilt. "She fought me. She tried to run." His voice cracked. "I could not let her leave." He described how he had forced her toward his car, insisting he only meant to teach her a lesson. The words were chilling in their simplicity. A predator justified his cruelty as control. He admitted to driving her away from a neighborhood, his obsession blinding him to the horror he was inflicting. He never said exactly how her life ended, only that she stopped struggling. The vagueness made the truth even more disturbing. Harold's confession went beyond Carol. He spoke of other women, tenants he had watched, followed, and threatened. His control over them had given him a twisted sense of power. "They needed to know who was in charge," he said, his voice a whisper of shame and pride. By the time Harold stopped speaking, the room was thick with the weight of his words. Amy sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the man who had hidden in plain sight for decades. His confession confirmed what Carol's family had always feared. She had been taken by someone she knew, someone who had turned trust into a weapon. When officers entered the room to escort him to holding, Harold did not resist. He shuffled forward, the weight of his years heavy on his shoulders. Yet for the first time, the mask was gone. The predator had revealed himself. For Amy, the confession was not victory but validation. The silence that had haunted this case for 30 years was finally broken. But with it came the darkest truth, that Carol's life had been stolen by a man who believed control was his right. And now, at last, that man would face justice. The news spread through Queens like wildfire. After 30 years of silence, police cars pulled up outside Harold Brennan's building in the fall of 2023. Neighbors watched from windows and sidewalks as the elderly landlord, once seen as nothing more than a quiet figure feeding pigeons on the stoop, was let out in handcuffs. His frail frame, bent with age, did little to soften the horror of what people had just learned. The man who had lived among them for decades was a predator. Reporters swarmed the block within hours. Headlines called it "The Nurse Vanishing Solved" and "Landlord Arrested After 30 Years." Television crews captured images of Brennan being escorted into custody, his expression blank as flashes lit his face. For longtime residents, disbelief turned into fear. He lived right here all these years, one woman told cameras, and we never knew what he was capable of. For the Williams family, the arrest was a storm of emotions. Marcus stood outside the courthouse, his jaw tight, his voice unsteady. "This does not bring my sister back," he said, "but it finally gives us answers." Their mother Evelyn wept as she clutched Carol's photograph, her tears falling with both grief and relief. For 30 years she had prayed for clarity, and now the truth had finally surfaced. The cost of waiting had been unbearable, but silence had been broken at last. The courtroom became the stage where 3 decades of mystery were laid bare. Prosecutors presented the evidence with precision. The touch DNA recovered from Carol's handbag, the gold locket discovered in Harold's storage unit, and the chilling testimonies of former tenants who described his harassment and threats. Each detail painted a picture of a man who had hidden his violence behind locked doors and routine. When the locket was held up before the jury, a hush fell over the room. Inside it, the photograph of Carol and Marcus smiled back at a courtroom filled with strangers. For the family, it was a reminder of the life stolen, the laughter silenced, and the years lost. Neighbors and former tenants filled the gallery, their faces etched with shock. Some shook their heads, struggling to reconcile the image of the quiet landlord with the predator described in testimony. Others sat in silence, too stunned to speak. One former tenant whispered to a reporter, "I always felt uneasy around him. I wish I had said something sooner." As the evidence unfolded, Harold sat motionless at the defense table. He no longer attempted to deny his actions. His earlier confession hung in the air, undeniable and damning. The jurors listened intently, their expressions grim. The arrest not only brought the Williams family a measure of closure, but also rattled the wider community. For years, Harold had been part of their neighborhood, his presence so ordinary that suspicion faded. Now, they learned he had been hiding the darkest of secrets. The betrayal cut deep. When the hearing ended that day, Evelyn and Marcus walked out of the courthouse together, their hands clasped tightly. Reporters surrounded them, asking if justice felt near. Evelyn's voice broke as she answered, "Justice is never complete when a life is gone, but at least the truth has spoken." Queens would never look at Harold Brennan's old apartment building the same way again. For the community, his arrest was a reminder that evil can live quietly among them, disguised by routine and silence. For Carol's family, it was the beginning of long-awaited accountability. But justice was not finished. The trial loomed ahead, promising to reveal even more of the darkness that Harold had kept hidden for decades. Carol Williams' story is more than the account of a crime solved after decades. It is a reminder of resilience, of the quiet but unyielding strength families carry when answers remain out of reach. For 30 years, the Williams family lived in uncertainty, clinging to fading hope, refusing to let Carol's memory vanish. Their persistence kept her name alive, ensuring her story was never fully silenced. This case also demonstrates the power of forensic science. What once seemed impossible, a single trace of touch DNA preserved on Carol's handbag, became the key that unlocked the truth. Technology advanced, and with it, the possibility of justice, even when time had nearly buried the evidence. It is a lesson that science does not merely serve the present. It carries a promise of the past. Equally important is the dedication of cold case detectives like Amy Rodriguez. Her determination transformed Forgotten File into a pursuit of justice. Where others had accepted silence, she pressed forward. Her work reflects the persistence of law enforcement officers who believe no case is too old, no victim undeserving of answers. But above all, Carol is remembered not only as a victim but as a daughter, a sister, and a nurse who devoted her life to caring for others. She is remembered for her laughter, her kindness, and the dreams cut short. By telling her story, justice does not end at the courtroom. It extends into memory, ensuring her life has meaning beyond tragedy. Carol's case is a testament to truth's endurance. Even decades later, justice can emerge from silence. The past may be long, but the truth waits patiently, ready to be found.